warm twilight, when the dust from the bonfires rose above the villages and the smell of blood mingled with the smoke, a ritual began that was called a marriage, but which was more like a public execution. The girl was brought out to the crowd, not as a bride, but as a victim. Her body trembled with fear, but her hands were held down by female relatives, while the men prepared a bowl of warm liquid glistening in the torchlight. It was blood, fresh, still warm, sometimes human, but more often bovine or goat. They forced her to drink until she vomited, while tears streamed down her face, and the crowd chanted ancient words promising fertility and obedience. Thus began the life of a married woman in a tradition where love was meaningless, and the body was merely a vessel for continuing the family line. Historical chronicles and ethnographic records of 19th century travelers have preserved descriptions of customs that make even modern researchers' hair stand on end. In the tribal societies of East and Central Africa, animal blood was considered a link between the living and the dead. A bride who drank it was symbolically united with the spirits of her husband's clan, but at the same time, she took in infections, intestinal parasites, and diseases that often cut her life short after just a few weeks. The participants in the ritual did not know the words salmonella or tuberculosis, but they saw perfectly well how the girls died one after another. Their deaths were explained by the wrath of the ancestors, rather than by the fact that their bodies could not withstand the violence. No less frightening were the rituals in South Asia, where marriage was seen as an act of final purification. A girl who had just reached her first menstruation was laid on a mat, and a vessel with the blood of a man, most often the eldest in the clan, was placed next to her. It was believed that her lips had to touch this vessel and take a few sips so that she would acknowledge her husband's authority. Medical treatises by Indian doctors of the 15th century mentioned proof of fertility when blood was mixed with spices and milk, and the bride was forced to drink it before her wedding night. The girls would faint and start vomiting, but no one paid any attention to this. A weak body was considered unworthy of continuing the family line. In these cultures, marriage became a test not only for the spirit, but also for the flesh. In addition to blood, the bride had to undergo mutilating procedures. In some parts of Africa, her genitals were circumcised on the eve of the wedding night to prove her purity. The operation was performed with rusty knives or stone fragments, accompanied by the cries of female relatives and the approving shouts of men. The bleeding was so severe that many girls died before dawn. But this was considered an honor. To die on your wedding day meant to sacrifice yourself for the family. Ethnographers of the colonial era left dry records. 4 men held the girl down. Blood flowed onto the ground. Then they gave her a drink of goat's blood and herbs. Behind these lines lie real torment, the smell of iron, cries of pain, and a crowd that saw this not as cruelty, but as tradition. The participants in the rituals believed that pain and blood were necessary for the birth of new life, and that only in this way could a woman become a proper mother. Deaths were a common outcome, and no one considered them a tragedy. It was the will of the spirits. The nights after such weddings rarely brought peace. The girl, weakened by blood loss and forced drinking, fell into the hands of her husband, who had to complete the ritual. It was believed that if the bride did not die on the first night, it meant that her body was strong enough to bear children. In some regions of Indonesia, legends about wedding coffins, boxes kept near the groom's house, still survive. Brides who did not survive their wedding night were placed in them. Their funerals were held without mourning, as death was considered part of the ritual. All this took place in front of the community. No one asked the girl if she wanted this. Relatives prepared her for pain from childhood. They told stories about how a proper wife must suffer, showed her the mutilated bodies of her older sisters, and taught her to remain silent when being cut. A woman ceased to belong to herself from the moment she was declared a bride. The blood of animals, the blood of her husband, The blood of her own flesh became a single drink that bound her to a new family. It was a union based not on trust or love, but on blood and fear. It was this union that became a symbol of the power of the elders and male clans. The more blood was shed at the wedding, the stronger their clan appeared to be. The girl became a sacrifice, her body used to demonstrate the power and sanctity of tradition. And even if she survived, her life became a continuous series of births, exhausting labor and pain that began on her wedding night and never ended. The crowd, accustomed to the spectacle of pain, never thought about what the girl herself was going through. After the first wedding night, her body remained not only torn, but also infected. Historical accounts of Indian and African practices contain evidence of mandatory checks. The next morning, the husband's relatives would examine the bed. There had to be abundant bloodstains as proof of virginity and successful penetration. If there was not enough, the girl could be subjected to repeated rape, sometimes immediately in front of witnesses, so as not to disgrace the family. Medical treatises preserved from 14th century Islamic Eastern physicians described the weakness of the female vessel, which meant that proof was not always visible. But this was not accepted in the community. A woman either had to shed blood or was considered defiled and could be killed. 19th century ethnographers who traveled through Somalia and Sudan left records that special objects were sometimes used to guarantee the correct result. Sharp bamboo sticks or acacia thorns were inserted into the girl's body to cause bleeding. This was done by the older women of the clan, who explained that this is what the ancestors demand. The girl would lose consciousness from the pain, and her wounds would become infected. But the next morning, the bed would be covered in blood, and everyone would be satisfied. There was no treatment. Herbs were applied only to stop the bleeding, and this often resulted in sepsis. In Asia, rituals associated with the symbolism of male blood played a special role. In some areas of the Himalayas, the bride was required to drink a mixture of the groom's blood and rice wine. It was believed that her fertility directly depended on how much she absorbed her husband's strength. Brides who were poisoned by this mixture often died the same night from infection or suffocation, but this only strengthened the belief in the ritual. Weak flesh is not worthy of continuing the family line. Medieval chronicles of Tibetan monasteries mention that religious elements were added to weddings. Blood was perceived as a direct sacrifice to the gods, and the bride's suffering was seen as proof of her readiness for marriage. Pain also accompanied purification rituals. In some regions of Southeast Asia, there was a custom of pouring animal blood over a girl from head to toe, and then forcing her to stand under the scorching sun until she fainted. This act was supposed to wash away her childhood and prepare her for adult life. Contemporaries described the smell of rotting blood, swarms of insects covering the body, and crowds laughing at the girl's suffering. Skin burns, infectious ulcers, and dehydration were common consequences. Girls often died, but the elders claimed that this was a sign from heaven, and that the bride herself was to blame for being unworthy of the ceremony. A special place was reserved for wedding trials, which tested endurance. In some areas of Ethiopia, the bride was forced to run several laps around the village after her legs had been cut to draw blood. She had to show that she would endure pain for the sake of the family. Falling was considered a disgrace, and relatives could beat the girl with sticks. The wedding thus turned into an arena where the woman's body was demonstratively destroyed, and the community enjoyed the spectacle, justifying it with ancient words about honor and fertility. These customs were reinforced by the authority of men and priests. In each ritual, blood served not only as a symbol of new life, but also as an instrument of control. A woman had to show her willingness to suffer and submit. If she died, her death became part of the myth of the clan, strengthening the power of the male clans. If she survived, she became living proof of the power of tradition. That is why such practices were passed down for centuries, despite their obvious cruelty and mortality. But particularly frightening were cases where rituals involving the dead were mixed with marriage rituals. Some tribes in East Africa believed that the blood of the deceased strengthened the marriage. The girl was given diluted blood from a deceased relative of the groom to drink, believing that this would bind her to the clan forever. Ethnographers have preserved descriptions of such weddings. A young bride, struggling and crying, bowls with thick viscous liquid, elders shouting that the spirits demand a sacrifice. This was not just mockery, it was institutionalized torture, supported by religious fear and collective cruelty. And the more blood was shed at weddings, the more the myth of the sanctity of tradition was reinforced. People saw death, but did not consider it a tragedy. For them, it was part of marriage, part of a woman's obligatory path, turning her life into a series of pain and submission. And it was in this blood that a new union was born, a union that had nothing to do with love or consent. Religious precepts and the power of the priests made these marriage rituals almost indestructible. When blood was shed in the marriage hut or in the open square, the elders and shamans would declare, "This is what the spirits demand. This is what the ancestors teach. This is the will of heaven." In South India, Brahmins interpreted ancient texts, claiming that a woman must purify herself through suffering, and only then will she be able to bear sons worthy of the family. In North Africa, imams covered up bloody practices by referring to tribal tradition, saying that pain is a sacrifice for Allah. In Tibet, monks supplemented wedding ceremonies with prayers, accompanying them with libations of animal blood, claiming that without this, the union would not be recognized by the gods. Thus, not just a tradition was formed, but a dogma rooted in fear of punishment for disobedience. Political power supported these practices as a means of control. Girls were hostages to custom, their bodies turned into instruments for demonstrating the power of male clans. The chronicles of 10th century Arab travelers contain descriptions of how the rulers of Sudan arranged mass weddings, where the blood of dozens of brides was mixed in the square. It was a demonstrative act. The more suffering, the stronger the leader's power. In 17th century Indonesia, local princes ordered marriage rituals to be performed at court so that everyone could see the submissiveness of women and the sanctity of tradition. In this way, the personal suffering of an individual girl became a political spectacle. Religious fears reinforced silence. A woman who refused to participate in the ritual was considered cursed. In Ethiopia, there was a belief that if a bride did not drink the blood of an animal, her children would be ugly or stillborn. In Tibet, it was said that the mountain spirits would unleash an avalanche on the village if the ritual was interrupted. In India, it was believed that the goddesses would turn away from the family if the girl did not shed blood on her wedding night. These threats were so powerful that even mothers prepared their own daughters for torture, understanding that refusal would mean death not only for the girl, but for the whole family. The fear of collective punishment cemented the ritual more firmly than any law. What was particularly gruesome was that religion turned the death of the bride into an honor. A girl who died on her wedding night was buried as a sacrifice to the gods, and her grave became a place of worship. The chronicles of 17th century missionaries contain descriptions of villages where such graves were considered sacred. Food was brought to them, pieces of cloth were laid on them, in the belief that the spirit of the deceased would bless the harvest. In this way, tragedy acquired an aura of holiness, and torture became a gift from heaven. The living girls saw that death at a wedding did not evoke pity, but rather worship, and this broke their resistance even before the ceremony. Blood became a universal symbol of submission. In Bengal, there were customs where husbands smeared their wives' faces with their blood on their wedding day, leaving a mark of belonging. In Africa, elders sometimes made an incision on the chest of the bride and groom, forcing them to exchange blood, but in reality, this was a way to emphasize that the girl's body was now completely subordinate to her husband. European chronicles of the 15th century, describing overseas countries, recorded these customs with horror, but did not interfere. For the colonizers, this was proof of savagery that could be used to justify their conquests. But even where colonial missionaries tried to eradicate bloody weddings, religion found ways around it. The ban on drinking blood was replaced by purification through bloodletting or ritual blows, from which the girl had to bleed at least a drop. The power of men remained unshakable. Pain was a necessary condition for marriage, and without it, the union was considered invalid. Even in regions where bloody practices had disappeared, the memory of them remained in fairy tales, legends, and the fear of women who knew that their bodies did not belong to them, but to their clan and the gods. This system, built on pain and blood, was not accidental, but a carefully constructed mechanism. It simultaneously strengthened religious authority, political control, and social hierarchy. Girls became a living reminder that tradition is stronger than man, that suffering is the only path to recognition, and it was this mixture of religion and politics that transformed the wedding ceremony from a personal event into a collective act of violence that continued for centuries. When European missionaries and colonial officials first encountered these marriage rites, their reactions ranged from horror to cold calculation. Reports by 19th century British administrators contain descriptions of weddings in India and Africa where brides died before dawn. Some officials wrote about barbarism and demanded that the practices be banned, while others believed that intervention would destroy the social order and cause riots. Therefore, in most cases, the authorities preferred to turn a blind eye. Colonial powers used the cruelty of others as a tool. Public bloody weddings were proof of savagery that could be exploited for political purposes, but they themselves were in no hurry to eradicate traditions because the suffering of women helped to keep communities submissive. Missionaries, especially Catholic and Protestant ones, tried to combat these rituals by replacing them with Christian ones. However, even here, terrible compromises were made. Where it was impossible to completely ban bloody practices, missionaries agreed to softened forms. For example, instead of drinking blood, girls were given red wine to drink, and instead of circumcision, only a symbolic incision was required. Thus, the rituals were transformed, but the essence remained the same. A woman's body had to suffer and shed blood for the marriage to be considered valid. In the missionaries' diaries, one can find entries about the inevitability of pain as an element of local spirituality, which effectively legalized torture. Hybrid forms of rituals that emerged at the intersection of tradition and colonial power attracted particular attention. In some parts of Africa, in the 20th century, weddings were held with the participation of a priest, but immediately after the ceremony, the groom's relatives demanded that the bride perform an ancient custom, drink goat's blood, or undergo a ritual knife wound. Thus, Christian marriage became merely a shell, while the core remained the same: blood, pain, and submission. Women were caught in a double captivity, in the name of both the new religion and the old tradition. Colonial armies also sometimes interfered in weddings, but more often for demonstrative purposes. There are mentions that in Sudan, British officers demanded that an exemplary wedding be held for European guests to show the exoticism of local customs. In such cases, the bride was subjected to the same torture, but now her suffering became a spectacle not only for the community, but also for foreigners. These weddings were described as folklore shows, although behind them lay real screams, blood, and death. A girl could die right before the eyes of missionaries and officials, but in official reports, it was presented as an unsuccessful completion of the ceremony. Colonial medicine added another sinister element. Doctors trained in Europe recorded the consequences: blood poisoning, sepsis, infertility, death. But instead of stopping the practices, they often turned women into guinea pigs. Hospitals in British India recorded cases of the consequences of traditional marriage rituals. and used the girls' bodies to study infections. Girls who survived the wedding ended up in hospitals with purulent wounds and bleeding, but they were treated not for the sake of saving them, but for the sake of observation. Colonial reports stated dryly, "A case of septic infection after a marriage ceremony has been investigated," and these lines became a scientific justification for suffering. The situation was particularly dire in regions where colonial authorities used local elders as intermediaries. To maintain their power, they were allowed to continue the rituals, and they, in turn, emphasized their necessity. Girls remained pawns in this policy. Even in the 20th century, many of them died in marriage rituals, and missionaries recorded only difficulties in Christianizing the population. Thus, religion and colonial power did not destroy bloody weddings, but only gave them a new form, more hidden, but no less cruel. This continued for decades. Girls were maimed and killed in front of Europeans, and this was considered part of cultural heritage. The archives contain photographs of smiling officials posing next to young couples, and only by looking closely at the bride's face can one see traces of fear, pain, and blood. These photographs are silent evidence of how colonial powers and religious missions turned female death into a cultural compromise covered up with words about tradition and civilization. Today, centuries after the rituals described, the memory of bloody weddings has not disappeared. In some regions of Africa and Asia, traditions have been preserved in a hidden form under the guise of cultural heritage or religious practice. Officially, governments and international organizations prohibit mutilating rituals, but in villages, ceremonies are still secretly held, where girls are forced to drink animal blood, subjected to painful incisions, or tested for purity on their wedding night. Modern journalists and human rights activists record the testimonies of women who have survived such experiences, stories of screams, fainting, and relatives holding them down while elders cut their bodies with blunt knives. The memory of the tradition is passed down not in chronicles, but in the scars on the bodies of the living. The psychological trauma is often no less terrible than the physical. Women who have survived such weddings talk about nightmares, fear of intimacy, and hatred of their own bodies. Many remain infertile due to infections or injuries sustained on their wedding night. But a culture of silence still prevails in these communities. A woman who decides to speak out about her experience risks being ostracized and accused of bringing shame on her family. Thus, fear continues to reign, even as the practices themselves gradually disappear. 21st century doctors are confronted with the consequences of traditions that their patients do not talk about directly. World Health Organization reports show that tens of thousands of women suffer complications each year from cultural rituals associated with weddings. Sepsis, infertility, chronic pain, and post-traumatic stress disorder are all direct legacies of customs that were once considered sacred. Doctors in Sudan, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and India continue to see cases where young wives are admitted to hospital a day after their wedding, bleeding profusely or in a coma. But often relatives do not allow intervention, believing that this is how it should be. Modern religious leaders do not always condemn these practices. In some countries, imams and priests continue to justify the pain as necessary to preserve tradition or the will of the ancestors. Politicians use the issue even more cynically. In election campaigns, they promise to protect cultural values, which conceal bloody customs. And although many young people in cities reject old rituals, in villages they are observed as law for fear of the wrath of the community and the spirits. Thus, blood remains part of the marriage union, even if not always openly. Memory plays a special role. Even where the rituals have disappeared, the fear of them lives on in legends and family stories. Older women remember how they were held down on the ground, how they screamed, how a warm liquid with an iron taste poured into their mouths. These memories are passed on to daughters and granddaughters, and even if weddings are no longer accompanied by blood, the women themselves go to the altar with fear. The psychological shadow of the past becomes part of the marriage, which means that the ritual lives on in memory more strongly than in action. Journalists, researchers, and documentary filmmakers of the 21st century continue to record these stories, but even the most gruesome footage cannot convey the smell of decay, the taste of blood, and the feeling of helplessness that millions of women have experienced. The cameras show faces, frightened, submissive, broken. But behind each face is a system that for centuries considered female suffering a necessary condition of marriage. These chronicles sound not like stories from the distant past, but like a confession of living history, continuing here and now. And so, the conversation about bloody weddings is not only an exploration of cruel customs, but also a mirror that reflects the very nature of power and religion. Marriage, which was supposed to be a union, has for centuries turned into an arena of pain, where a woman's body became a sacrifice for the sake of the myth of fertility and honor. And as long as the memory of blood is preserved in legends, as long as fear lives in families, the story of these weddings is not over. It continues in the shadows, in secret rituals, in scars on bodies, in silence that is louder than any words,